Alright guys, how's it going? Over this past couple of weeks, I've had one or two requests about doing certain videos, and one that popped up a lot was of course AMD's next generation CPU architecture, Zen. Now obviously this is a subject that's really close to a lot of people's hearts, and I'm pretty sure that we all want to see AMD doing a lot better. Because the fact of the matter is, the CPU market is absolutely dead. For the past 5 years we've had effectively zero progress on the CPU front. It's just really boring, there's nothing to talk about, there's nothing to get excited about. I have a Sandy Bridge i5 2500K, which I bought 4 years ago, and I have got no desire to upgrade it to anything. Because mostly it's a side grade, especially for somebody like me who is a gamer. And because of AMD's lack of performance, Intel can just segment the crap out of the market, selling what is effectively $150 dual cores, so we really do need a bit more competition here. Now it wasn't always the case, yeah? Over the last 20 years or so, Intel and AMD swapped the lead. It was however about 10 years ago, actually 11 years ago now, when AMD last held the lead with the Athlon X2s and the FXs. Intel was going through a pretty bad phase at that time, and AMD had multiple faster processors. Now those of you that follow the CPU market closely probably know that Intel cheated, and in fact they bribed PC builders, including companies like Dell and IBM and Hewlett Packard. They were bribed billions of dollars to not use AMD's CPUs, and this really held AMD back from gaining a majority share. As you can see though, in 2006, they were practically even at 50% market share. Now AMD is a much smaller company than Intel and always has been, so to even have 50% market share is pretty incredible. However, it would for sure have been even higher had Intel not bribed the PC makers. In 2006, Intel finally released a decent architecture again. It was the Core 2 architecture, and it was another clear step ahead of anything we had seen previously. This was 10 years ago, and AMD has never held the lead since this point, and it's very easy to believe that they may never do it again. Because since this point 10 years ago, AMD has released some pretty mediocre to some downright awful CPU architectures, including the latest one based on the Bulldozer microarchitecture in 2011. So while we can certainly blame Intel for bribing the PC makers back in early 2000s, Intel can't be blamed for AMD's current predicament and really poor CPUs. Understanding why Bulldozer was so bad should help us with understanding why Zen can't possibly be so bad. So let's take a look at why Bulldozer was such a massive failure. There are really two parts to CPU development. You've got the design, or the architecture, and you've got the process in which the CPU is built on. Now I did a video on it, Nano Matters. Check that one out if you want to learn more about manufacturing CPUs. In the case of Bulldozer, AMD managed to fail everywhere. But let's just take a look at these failings right now. One of the major failings of Bulldozer was its single thread performance. In other words, how well it performed when only one core was used. And yes, that is at the bottom behind the previous generation AMD CPUs. In other words, AMD had managed a regression in single core performance. And as you can see, it was a very long way behind Intel's Sandy Bridge CPUs. However, it was actually quite good when it came to multiple thread usage. And here you can see that it was pretty good compared to the i5s. And in certain loads could even beat the i7s. So is that a fair trade-off? Well, no, not really. Especially not when you look at the power consumption that the Bulldozer CPUs required. You're effectively looking at double the power consumption for equal performance. The poor single thread performance combined with a higher power draw meant that the Bulldozer FX CPUs were a very hard sell for gamers. But how bad can it really be, right? Slower, hotter, more power hungry CPUs, you're just going to have to sell them a little bit cheaper and still make a profit, right? Not in the case of Bulldozer you didn't, because it was also a very large chip, 315 square millimeters, which meant that you could only get a maximum of 179 chips on a 300mm wafer, while Intel's Sandy Bridge had a maximum of 269 chips on a wafer. So Intel was faster, they consumed much less power, and they were also much cheaper to manufacture. In effect, this allowed Intel to charge whatever prices they wanted, and AMD's Bulldozer series got resigned to the bargain basement. And here's the thing about chip design. It is a multi-year process. If you've got a bad architecture, You can't just go and fix that next year. You can improve on the worst of it. Slight fixes to power draw, slightly more speed, but you are stuck with a dog of an architecture until the next one is ready. So if you're wondering why AMD continues to lag behind Intel, that is why. For the past 4.5 years, they have been stuck on this crappy Bulldozer architecture. They have improved on it quite a bit, but there's only so much that can be done with something that was inherently bad to start with. Intel, on the other hand, have got a good base architecture and they just do small improvements on it every other year. And this is why the market share looks like this. It's actually a lot worse than this now. I'm pretty sure AMD's well below 20% and still falling. Zen, however, is a brand new architecture, so all of this stuff goes out the window. Like I said, chip design is a multi-year project, and in 2012 AMD brought back Jim Keller with the explicit purpose of designing Zen. Jim Keller is a very famous, very accomplished chip architect, and in AMD circles is something of a hero, mostly due to his design of AMD's K7 and K8, the chips which hammered Intel into the ground in the early 2000s. He also worked at Apple on the A4 and A5 and was a co-author of 64-bit computing. Now working at Tesla Motors, he is clearly a very competent person. Around 18 months to 2 years later, AMD began to talk about Zen much more openly and in public, and one of the first slides we saw was that Zen was expected to have 40% more instructions per clock, or IPC. This is very important because IPC is directly related to single core performance. There are basically two aspects to single core performance, your instructions per clock and your clock speeds. Intel CPUs are known for very high instructions per clock and good clock speeds, which is why they are so fast. Bulldozer, of course, was very poor in single-threaded performance because the instructions per clock were so low. Now you can make up some of the deficit there with increasing clock speeds, and some of the FX Bulldozer CPUs reached very high clock speeds. However, higher clock speeds means higher power draw, and this is one of the reasons why Bulldozer had such awful power efficiency. AMD were forced to massively increase the clock speeds well past the optimal range in order to make the CPUs semi-competitive on raw speed. So with the design of the Zen core, it became very important for AMD to fix this IPC issue they have, and that way they're not forced to ramp up clocks as much as possible in order to stay semi-competitive. As I mentioned earlier in the video, there are two parts to creating a successful chip. The architecture, that's your stuff like your IPC, yeah? Your instructions per clock. That's one part. The second part is getting the process right. Bulldozer and Piledriver, its follow-up, were built on GlobalFoundries 32nm process. Intel's Sandy Bridge was also built on a 32nm process. However, not all processes are created equally, and it was pretty obvious that Intel's 32nm process was a lot better than GlobalFoundries. GlobalFoundries had many issues with it. It was very late, yields were very poor, and it was just not a very good process in the end. And this served to further hamstring Bulldozer due to very high power draw, as you saw. Since that point, AMD moved on to 28nm, which is sort of a fixed, slightly better version than GlobalFoundries 32nm. All the while, Intel went 32nm down to 22nm and now 14nm, getting smaller chips, better power consumption, slightly better performance. Now that we're moving on to Zen, AMD is finally getting themselves a decent process. GlobalFoundries has been a disaster for AMD, but finally, on 14nm FinFETs, AMD is going to be really close on process node technology to Intel for the first time in many years. It's important to note that GlobalFoundries did not actually develop this process, they licensed it from Samsung. And this 14nm FinFET technology looks to be exceptionally good. An earlier version of the technology was used to build Apple's A9 chip, which was seen in the iPhone 6s, and it's an updated version of this, which GlobalFoundries will be using to make all of AMD's 2016 chips, including graphics and CPUs, which of course includes Zen. So this is a really big thing for AMD, and it's going to fix their power consumption issues. AMD's talking a lot about efficiency all of a sudden, and this is something to pay attention to, what these companies are talking about. All of a sudden for AMD, it's about efficiency. And Samsung's and GlobalFoundries 14nm FinFET technology looks to be exceptionally efficient. And we've already seen it in action when AMD demoed their Polaris 10 GPU a couple of months ago. Let's get real here for a minute though. Intel was first to 14nm, they've been there for over a year, they are known to be a real powerhouse when it comes to manufacturing. They have spent the past 5 to 10 years improving IPC. Every year, small improvements, making their chips faster and faster. If you watch my Nano Matters video, you will know that Intel's 14nm is a true 14nm, whereas Samsung's is more like a 20nm with FinFETs. So if we get real here and just look at the advantages that Intel has, no matter what AMD does here, they're still at a pretty big disadvantage. How good can AMD's new architecture be? Is it even possible for AMD to make up these disadvantages? And if not, what else can they do to make their Zen CPUs desirable? Well, this is where it gets interesting. As I mentioned before, Intel has been segmenting the crap out of the market. And because of their massive size and their massive market share, they have to do things in certain ways. For example, here is their newest quad-core Skylake CPU. And on the left-hand side is the graphics. 1/3 of the chip has been given over to processor graphics. This is simply because most people make do with their integrated processor graphics. Intel sells millions of these chips and massively leads the graphics market share over AMD and Nvidia combined. Which is very surprising to most people, but that is a fact. Intel has over 70% of the graphics market because of stuff like this. AMD has gone on record and has confirmed on multiple occasions that they will not be adding any Radeon integrated graphics onto these desktop and server Zen CPUs. So it's sort of like Intel's high-end stuff. Their 6 and 8 core i7s, they don't have any processor integrated graphics. Instead they've got extra cores, and they also cost an awful lot of money, especially the ones at the very high end. So if AMD isn't going to be putting processor graphics onto the Zen CPUs, all that space at the left hand side can be filled with more cores at the same effective cost to manufacture. Now it's probably going to have some kind of graphics multimedia controller on the CPU. However, it's clearly not going to have anything like 1/3 of the CPU die given over to graphics. So this is a big advantage in terms of raw CPU power. However, when you add more cores, you're adding a lot more power. Or more likely, you need to lower clock speeds. Earlier in the video I talked about IPC and clock speeds, and this is why. To me it's pretty unlikely that AMD is going to be able to offer 8 cores at the same kind of clock speeds as what Intel offers. So even with 40% extra IPC, you may find that clock speeds are down 20% or even more. However, the way around this is of course by using turbos. So when most of the cores aren't being used, the cores that are being used can increase their clock speeds so that the single thread performance can remain high. This is a very important area of chip design, and it's something that AMD has been working on very hard the past few years. This is one of the areas where they have improved on Bulldozer a lot. Better power management, better clock speeds, better turbo speeds. And this is all stuff that's going to carry over to Zen. Up until last week, we'd been under the impression that Zen was going to come in 8 cores. 8 cores with hyper-threading technology, which is basically the same as Intel's high-end i7s. However, this all changed last week when a CERN engineer let slip this nugget of information on Zen. It covered some stuff that we already know, like it's going to be using a 14nm FinFET process technology, and that it was expected to bring a 40% improvement for IPC. However, down at the bottom things started to get really interesting when it mentioned that Zen would come in up to 32 physical cores. Now clearly we're talking about server CPUs here, and the engineer went on to mention that in order to get to 32 cores, it would be 2 chips basically fused together in what's known as an MCM, a multi-chip module package. But that alone was very interesting because that means that the largest single Zen CPU die is going to be 16 cores. Now it's possible and even probable that AMD will be making 2 different Zen CPUs, one with 16 cores and one with 8 cores. The reason for this is simple. A 16-core CPU is a very large CPU, clearly, yeah? And we already know that the bigger the CPU is, the less of them you can get on a wafer. Stuff like 16 and 32 cores, not really all that useful for us guys, yeah? It's mostly for server loads. This is why CERN engineers are using them and not us. That said, there is nothing to stop AMD from offering this on the desktop as well, in much the same way that Intel does. I would not, however, expect these to come very cheap. If we take a look at the die sizes that I mentioned earlier, let's take Skylake for example. Here we have a 4-core or 8-thread, this could be an i7 or an i5, at almost 500 dies per wafer, and a tiny 122mm squared. If you compare that to Bulldozer, which AMD is currently selling at less than half the price and only 179 dies on a wafer, then you can clearly see that AMD is set to make an awful lot of money, so long as they don't do another Bulldozer. Even a 16-core Zen CPU is likely to be smaller than their current 8-core Bulldozer CPUs. And while Bulldozer sells for a couple of $100, 16-core Zen CPUs are gonna go for a couple of $1,000 at least. My analysis of the situation is this: AMD simply cannot lose out of this because they already hit rock bottom. Anything must be better than Bulldozer. And Zen, if they deliver on their promises, Zen could be absolutely massive for the company. Here is Intel's revenue by segment: 57% on client computing group, and another 30% on the data center, which is their server CPU sales. Overall, that server market's worth about $15 billion per year. AMD used to hold about half of that. Now they only own half of 1% of that. If AMD can make a CPU that is only capable of gaining 10% of that market back, that would be $1.5 billion in revenue to a company that only makes about $4 billion in revenue every year. And that is simply 10% of the server market. If they can do that to the server market, they can certainly do more to the desktop market, which is even larger. This is why AMD is a CPU company. There is a lot of money to be made in CPUs. Way more money in CPUs than there is in graphics cards. But as we've seen before, Intel is not about to give up anything easily. And the way they've got the market segmented, and the way they build smaller and smaller CPUs every year and collect more money, they really have got themselves into a position where they cannot afford to lose anything. Because this is high margin stuff, yeah? $1.5 billion in server revenue could be $1 billion off of Intel's bottom line. So this is going to get very interesting. AMD knows this, and they can happily go with larger die sizes, taking less of a cut. It is still going to be massively more than what they make now. What about us though? Consumers on the desktop. Somebody like me with my i5 2500K. What would AMD need to do to entice me to purchase a Zen CPU? Well, I have no interest whatsoever in 4-core CPUs. The only worthwhile upgrade to me would be 8 cores or, at the very least, 4 cores with hyperthreading. Now this assumes that AMD is not going to be able to match Intel core for core, gigahertz for gigahertz. I just think that's a little bit too much to ask based on what we've talked about before. However, there is no reason why AMD cannot offer 8 cores for the price at which Intel offers 4 cores and yet still make an awful lot of money. Even if AMD's single cores are a little bit slower, the fact that they are offering 8 for the price of 4 would certainly be more than enough for somebody like me to switch. In a way, I'm something of a power user. I edit and render videos. A 30-minute video can take 45 minutes to an hour. That's an hour of my day sitting around doing nothing much, yeah? If I had 8 cores instead of 4, then I'd be looking at halving that time. So if AMD can offer similar gaming performance at the same time, then this is a no-brainer for me. Most people, however, are not rendering videos every day, so the gaming performance is what is going to matter most. I've talked about DX12 a lot in other videos, and if you watched those, then you'll know that DX12 is likely to make a move towards more cores and less clock speed, which again is going to be playing into AMD's hands, but that one remains to be seen. In the end, that is my analysis of the situation. I believe that AMD is going to offer more cores than Intel at a similar price. I believe that Zen will not be quite capable of matching Skylake, core for core, clock speed for clock speed, but it only has to be close. Perhaps one of the best pieces of news though is that the cut down Zen, the 4-core part, surely is going to finally put paid to dual cores and stuff like the dual core hyper-threaded CPUs. So even at the bottom end of the market, we can expect to see true quad cores, perhaps even with hyper-threading, becoming the entry level. This is something that everybody should be celebrating, gamers in particular, because when the entry level gets that good, it can only mean that games improve. And all that needs to happen is that AMD, please do not give us another Bulldozer. This 40% more instructions per clock, this is the key. What AMD was talking about 2 years ago, their target, back then, they didn't have the silicon, this was all based on simulations. Now though, they almost certainly have silicon in their hands, even if it's only test chips or the initial batch of chips that have come back from Global Foundries. Now however, they're talking about Zen on track to achieve greater than 40% IPC uplift. And they are talking about their several key design wins with global OEMs. And based on the recent information, we can be fairly certain that CERN will be one of their customers. It's been a very long time since AMD had customers like these, so hopefully that's a very good sign. There was also another good sign recently. As you know, Global Foundries and Samsung use the same process because Global Foundries licenses it from Samsung. A couple of months ago, AMD signed a deal for Samsung to fab their chips in 2017. Now, AMD has this thing called the WSA, or the Wafer Supply Agreement, with Global Foundries, which basically forces them to make chips at Global Foundries, and every year they have struggled to pay this off because, simply put, they can't sell the CPUs that they need to sell, yeah? Nobody wants Bulldozer. So every year they need to renegotiate this wafer supply agreement with Global Foundries, or they end up paying penalties for not using enough wafers. This goes on until 2025, and if you ask yourself, why would AMD go to Samsung to get more chips built at Samsung's fabs unless they knew that Zen was very, very good? All they would be doing is leaving themselves open to paying more penalties if they can't make money on Zen. So that one, definitely worth thinking about as well. It's looking pretty good, but if any company in the world can mess this up, it's AMD. As always guys, there's a bunch of links in the description below, and as always, there'll be a lively chat in the comments section. Catch you later guys.